The winter air in Washington carried more than just the bite of January cold. It carried the weight of civilization itself, balanced on the edge of a precipice no human generation had ever faced before. John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood in the Oval Office for the first time as president, his breath visible in the morning chill, staring at the red telephone that connected directly to Moscow, knowing that a single miscalculation could turn American cities into radioactive dust within 30 minutes. Outside, crowds still celebrated his inauguration, their voices echoing across the frozen mall. But inside these walls, the celebration had already died. The classified briefings spread across. His desk painted a world far more dangerous than any campaign speech had revealed. A world where Soviet missiles multiplied in the shadows and the previous administration's assurances now seemed hollow, perhaps even reckless. Dwight Eisenhower had left behind an empire of deterrence built on a single terrifying promise: massive retaliation, the threat that any Soviet aggression would be met with overwhelming nuclear force. Kennedy's hands trembled slightly as he read through the war plans, not from fear alone, but from the dawning horror of their implications. These strategies offered no middle ground, no room for miscalculation, no response between capitulation and apocalypse. His military advisors, holdovers from the previous administration, spoke in the confident tones of men who had won the last war, their faces lined with the victories of Normandy and the Pacific. But this was not that war, and Kennedy could feel in his bones that their certainty was misplaced, that the Cold War demanded something these veterans could not provide: flexibility, nuance, the ability to fight without ending the world. The intelligence reports grew worse with each passing hour of that frigid January day. The Soviets had shot down an American spy plane the previous year, exposing covert operations and embarrassing the nation on the world stage. The much-discussed missile gap between America and the Soviet Union remained shrouded in uncertainty, with estimates ranging from comfortable superiority to dangerous vulnerability. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin would soon orbit the Earth, demonstrating technological prowess that mocked American confidence. Kennedy felt the walls of the Oval Office closing in, understanding that he had inherited not just a government, but a ticking clock, and the men who had wound it were still sitting in positions of power throughout his administration. The question that haunted Kennedy's first nights in office was brutally simple, yet impossibly complex. How do you change direction when the ship is already heading toward the rocks, and the crew insists the course is correct? He looked again at the organizational charts, at the names of officials who had served Eisenhower faithfully, who now awaited his decisions with barely concealed skepticism. Their experience was undeniable, their patriotism unquestionable. But Kennedy sensed something they could not, that the old ways of thinking about this new kind of war might be the greatest danger of all. The conference room felt like a tomb, its walls lined with maps showing Soviet missile installations spreading across Eastern Europe like a cancer, each red pin representing a potential death sentence for millions. Kennedy sat at the head of the mahogany table, his advisors arranged before him in descending order of seniority and ascending order of doubt, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights that turned skin to parchment and eyes to hollows. General Maxwell Taylor stood at the projection screen, his pointer tapping against Cuba, then Berlin, then Laos, explaining why massive retaliation was no longer a strategy but a suicide pact. The old guard shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, men who remembered when American nuclear superiority was absolute, when threats alone could move Soviet tanks backward. But those days had died somewhere between the first Soviet atomic test and the hydrogen bombs that now filled their arsenals, and Kennedy could see that some of his inherited advisors still lived in that vanished world, refusing to accept that the rules had changed forever. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara leaned forward, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light as he challenged the assumptions that had governed American military thinking for a decade. His voice carried the precision of an engineer dissecting a failed machine, pointing out how Eisenhower's doctrine offered no response to guerrilla warfare in distant jungles or limited Soviet provocations that fell below the threshold of nuclear response. The room erupted in controlled fury, with senior military commanders arguing that flexibility was weakness, that the Soviets respected only overwhelming force and absolute commitment. Kennedy watched the clash of generations and philosophies unfold before him, understanding that this was not merely a policy debate, but a battle for the soul of American strategy. The younger advisers spoke of counterinsurgency and special forces, of winning hearts and minds, while the older men invoked the memory of Munich and appeasement, warning that any retreat from total deterrence would invite Soviet aggression. The tension crystallized around a single terrible question that hung in the tobacco-stained air like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. What happens when the Soviets make a move that does not warrant ending civilization but cannot be ignored? Kennedy's predecessor had built a fortress of nuclear weapons, each warhead a promise of apocalypse. But fortresses cannot move, and promises must eventually be tested. The old guard insisted their doctrine had kept the peace, that the absence of world war proved their wisdom beyond question. But Kennedy saw the cracks in their logic, the way they ignored the smaller conflicts already burning across the Third World, the insurgencies in Southeast Asia and Latin America, where nuclear weapons were useless and massive retaliation was absurd. As the meeting dissolved into barely civil arguments, Kennedy made a decision that would define his presidency, and perhaps doom some of the men in that room. He would build a new architecture of response, flexible and graduated, capable of fighting at every level of conflict, from covert operations to conventional warfare to nuclear exchange. The men who could not adapt to this vision, who clung to the certainties of the previous decade like drowning sailors to wreckage, would have to be replaced regardless of their service or loyalty. The Cold War had entered a new phase, and Kennedy needed advisors who understood that survival required more than threats. It required the ability to make good on those threats at any scale, and the wisdom to know which battles demanded which weapons. The intelligence briefing arrived at dawn, a leather portfolio stamped with security classifications that promised revelations no president should receive from strangers. Kennedy opened it in the Oval Office with Dean Rusk at his shoulder, and what they found inside turned the morning light cold against the windows. The previous administration had been flying reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory for years, each flight a calculated provocation that assumed American technological superiority would remain absolute and inviolable. But the assumptions had died over Sverdlovsk when a Soviet missile turned the invincible U-2 into burning wreckage and its pilot into a propaganda prize. And Kennedy realized that Eisenhower had been gambling with war itself while assuring the American people that peace was secure. The missile gap dominated the briefing like a specter that refused examination, a phantom threat that had terrorized the nation and justified massive defense expenditures. Kennedy's new analysts spread reconnaissance, photographs across his desk, their fingers tracing missile installations that didn't exist, their voices careful as they explained how previous estimates had been catastrophically wrong. The Soviets had fewer intercontinental ballistic missiles than America, not more, and the gap ran in the opposite direction of public fear. The intelligence community under Eisenhower had either failed to gather accurate information or failed to correct the misconceptions, and Kennedy understood that he had inherited advisors who either couldn't see the truth or wouldn't speak it. The implications spiraled outward like cracks in ice, suggesting that other assessments might be equally flawed, that the entire architecture of American strategy rested on foundations of sand and assumption. Allen Dulles sat across from Kennedy in the cabinet room, his face carrying the weight of a decade spent directing covert operations against an enemy he claimed to understand completely. The CIA director spoke with the confidence of a man who had toppled governments and installed friendly regimes, his words painting a picture of Soviet capabilities and intentions that Kennedy's new intelligence suggested was fantasy. The space race had become a humiliation, with Soviet rockets carrying cosmonauts into orbit while American missiles exploded on launch pads in flames visible from the viewing stands. Dulles insisted the situation was manageable, that Soviet advances were propaganda rather than genuine scientific achievement, but Kennedy had seen the trajectory analyses that proved otherwise. The man who had promised Eisenhower that American intelligence was comprehensive and reliable now seemed like a relic from an era when confidence could substitute for accuracy, when believing in American superiority made it real. The weight of inherited ignorance pressed against Kennedy's chest like a physical thing, making each breath feel labored in the recycled air of the Situation Room. He studied the faces of Eisenhower's intelligence chiefs, men who had dedicated their lives to understanding the Soviet threat and saw only certainty where doubt should live. They had failed to predict the U-2's vulnerability, misjudged Soviet missile production, underestimated their space program, and now they sat before him insisting their methods remained sound. Kennedy understood then that trust was impossible, that he would need to build his own intelligence apparatus, with analysts willing to question assumptions and admit uncertainty. The Cold War demanded truth, even when truth was terrifying, and the men who had served his predecessor seemed incapable of delivering anything except comfortable lies wrapped in classifications and clearances. The manila folders arrived in Kennedy's hands like obituaries for strategies not yet declared dead, each page documenting an operation that should never have left the planning stage. Operation Zapata sprawled across 1,400 pages of tactical assessments, logistics charts, and casualty projections, all stamped with Eisenhower administration approval seals that promised success against Castro's Cuba. Kennedy read through the night, while Georgetown slept outside his study windows, his coffee growing cold as he traced the invasion routes across maps that showed beaches backed by swamps and mountains, landing zones that seemed designed to trap rather than liberate. The CIA planners had promised a popular uprising would sweep through Cuba once the exiles landed, that Castro's regime would crumble like all communist governments when confronted with freedom's champions. But Kennedy saw only assumptions built on wishes and intelligence assessments that confused American desires with Cuban realities. Richard Bissell presented the operation in the West Wing basement, where maps covered walls and miniature ships represented the invasion fleet, his pointer moving across the Caribbean with the confidence of a man who believed his plan was flawless. The deputy director of plans had orchestrated the Guatemala coup years earlier, overthrowing a government with carefully placed bribes and a few hundred men, and he spoke of Cuba as though it were simply Guatemala enlarged. Kennedy listened to the timeline that gave Castro's Air Force hours to mobilize, watched the troop movements that assumed surprise would survive daylight landings, heard the supply calculations that depended on ships reaching beaches without opposition. The questions Kennedy asked received answers that dissolved under scrutiny, revealing that Eisenhower's covert warriors had fallen in love with their own creation and lost the ability to see its fatal flaws. The brigade waited in Guatemalan camps, 1,500 Cuban exiles training with American weapons and American promises that liberation was imminent and inevitable. Kennedy received their commander in the Oval Office, a man whose face carried the weight of homeland stolen and family scattered, whose eyes demanded action after months of preparation funded by American taxpayers. The moral trap closed around Kennedy's chest like a vice constructed by his predecessor, because canceling the operation meant abandoning men who had sacrificed everything for American assurances. But proceeding meant endorsing a plan he increasingly believed was catastrophic. Eisenhower's advisors had created obligations that transcended administrations, had committed American credibility to an operation designed before Kennedy took office, and now they sat in planning sessions insisting that presidential doubts were simply inexperience speaking. The realization crystallized in Kennedy's mind like ice forming across still water, cold and absolute and irreversible in its clarity. These men had brought him an inheritance of folly, disguised as strategic brilliance, had spent months planning an invasion that violated every principle of covert action, had created a monster that would devour his presidency regardless of whether he fed it or starved it. Their judgment was compromised by ideology that insisted communist governments were paper tigers, by arrogance that assumed American backing guaranteed success, by institutional momentum that made stopping harder than proceeding. Kennedy understood that inheriting their operation meant inheriting their blindness, and that trust, once broken, could never be restored, not when the stakes included war and the fragile peace that kept nuclear weapons in their silos. The conference room filled with cigarette smoke and the musty scent of leather. Briefcases carried by men whose suits had witnessed D-Day and Normandy, whose medals collected dust in desk drawers because wearing them seemed like boasting about a war everyone already remembered. Eisenhower's advisors sat with the posture of generals accustomed to deference, their grey hair combed in military precision, their faces mapped with lines earned in foxholes and command bunkers across Europe and the Pacific. Kennedy studied them from across the mahogany table and saw his father's generation, men who had defeated fascism with overwhelming force and total war, who believed every international crisis could be solved with the same doctrine that had worked against Hitler and Tojo. Their experience was undeniable, their service unquestionable, but Kennedy felt the weight of obsolescence pressing down on their recommendations, like gravity dragging dinosaurs toward extinction. His own team arrived carrying doctoral dissertations instead of combat ribbons, speaking in the language of game theory and limited war, rather than beachhead assaults and strategic bombing campaigns. McGeorge Bundy moved through national security briefings with the analytical precision of a Harvard dean dissecting a thesis, his mind organizing Cold War complexities into systems that could be managed rather than simply confronted with brute strength. Robert McNamara brought corporate efficiency from automobile production lines to Pentagon war planning, introducing statistical analysis and cost-benefit calculations to decisions that Eisenhower's generation had made through instinct and battlefield experience. These younger men wore their Ivy League credentials like armor against accusations of inexperience, insisting that nuclear weapons had transformed warfare into a chess game where intellect mattered more than courage, where miscalculation meant apocalypse rather than mere defeat. The tension crackled during joint meetings where generations collided over fundamental assumptions about Soviet intentions and American capabilities. Eisenhower's advisors spoke of communism as a monolithic enemy, requiring constant military pressure and unwavering nuclear threat, their voices carrying the certainty of men who had watched totalitarianism spread across continents. Kennedy's intellectuals countered with arguments about nationalist movements misunderstood as communist expansion, about guerrilla warfare that made conventional military superiority irrelevant, about the necessity of winning hearts and minds in the developing world rather than simply installing friendly dictators. The old guard heard dangerous naivety in these theories, the kind of weakness that invited aggression and emboldened enemies who respected only strength and resolve. Kennedy recognized the chasm was unbridgeable, that asking World War II veterans to embrace counterinsurgency doctrine was like demanding cavalry officers accept the tank's superiority. Their worldview had calcified around experiences that no longer applied to a Cold War fought in shadows and proxy conflicts, where nuclear stalemate made total victory. Impossible and limited engagement became the only rational strategy. The decision formed in his mind with the inevitability of morning light erasing stars. cold and necessary and irrevocable. These honorable men had become relics of a war already won, and the conflict ahead required different thinking, different methods, different minds willing to question every assumption their predecessors held sacred. The dismissals began on a Monday morning, when Alan Dulles received a telephone call that lasted less than 3 minutes, the CIA director's hand trembling slightly as he replaced the receiver and stared at the intelligence reports scattered across his desk like tombstones marking failed operations. Dulles had orchestrated coups in Iran and Guatemala, had built the agency into Eisenhower's primary weapon against communist expansion. But Kennedy saw only the U-2 disaster and the Bay of Pigs debacle waiting to unfold, saw an old man playing spy games while the world balanced on the edge of nuclear midnight. The office that Dulles vacated carried the ghost of Cold War certainties, now questioned by a president who believed the intelligence community had become too comfortable with its own mythology, too convinced of its infallibility to recognize how profoundly it misunderstood the enemy. Within hours, Richard Bissell followed him into forced retirement, the architect of covert operations stripped of his blueprints for Castro's overthrow, his protestations about operational necessity falling on ears that heard only excuses for incompetence. The National Security Council underwent surgery more radical than reorganization, Kennedy gutting the elaborate committee structure that Eisenhower had constructed with military precision and replacing it with a streamlined operation answering directly to Bundy's command. Committees that once included dozens of sub-cabinet officials discussing Cold War strategy over weekly luncheons found themselves dissolved by presidential memo, their members reassigned or encouraged to seek opportunities in the private sector, where their expertise might prove less dangerous to national survival. Gordon Gray packed his briefcase with classified documents he would never read again, his methodical approach to Soviet analysis suddenly deemed insufficient for crises that erupted without warning and demanded decisions measured in hours rather than committee reports, circulated for interdepartmental review. The purge extended through State Department offices where Eisenhower appointees discovered their security clearances under review, their policy recommendations quietly shelved by Kennedy operatives who trusted youth and academic credentials over bureaucratic experience. Kennedy summoned the remaining Eisenhower holdovers to the cabinet room and delivered his verdict with the clinical detachment of a surgeon explaining necessary amputation, his Boston accent softening words that carried the force of absolute dismissal. The old advisers listened with faces carved from granite, recognizing the finality in Kennedy's tone, but unable to suppress the belief that this young president was making a catastrophic mistake, trading institutional memory for intellectual fashion. They gathered their classified files and personal effects while winter rain streaked the White House windows, each man convinced that Kennedy's arrogance would inevitably collide with Soviet reality, that inexperience would exact its price in American blood and diplomatic humiliation. The hallways emptied of grey suits and military bearing, filled instead with younger men carrying coffee cups and policy papers, their confident voices echoing through corridors that suddenly felt less like command centers and more like university seminars where theories mattered more than consequences. The transformation completed itself within weeks. Kennedy's administration purged of Eisenhower's shadow and staffed with advisors who shared his conviction that the Cold War required reimagining rather than simply continuing the previous decade's strategies with minor modifications. The dismissed officials scattered to consulting firms and university positions, watching from outside, as Kennedy's team confronted the Berlin crisis with approaches that seemed dangerously naive to men who remembered Stalin and Yalta. But the president never looked backward, never questioned whether firing so many experienced Cold Warriors might leave his administration vulnerable to The very Soviet aggression his new team claimed to better understand. The old guard departed, believing history would vindicate their warnings, while Kennedy's intellectuals moved into their offices, convinced that fresh thinking had arrived just in time to save America from outdated doctrines that would have stumbled blindly toward nuclear catastrophe. The teletype machines in the Situation Room clattered with reports from Berlin at 3 in the morning, each mechanical keystroke announcing Soviet troop movements that Kennedy's inherited advisors would have interpreted through the lens of massive retaliation doctrine, while his new team struggled to understand Khrushchev's intentions through theories untested by crisis. Dean Rusk stood beside the illuminated map of divided Berlin, his finger tracing the boundary between East and West, while Kennedy absorbed intelligence that suggested the Soviets were preparing something unprecedented, something that required responses beyond the nuclear brinkmanship that Eisenhower's generals had perfected. The dismissed Cold Warriors would have recommended positioning tactical nuclear weapons as deterrents, would have drafted ultimatums threatening Soviet cities, but Kennedy's intellectuals proposed psychological assessments of Khrushchev's motivations and calibrated responses designed to leave diplomatic escape routes. The fluorescent lights cast shadows across faces too young for the decisions they confronted, eyes scanning reports that described tank concentrations and wire deliveries without revealing whether Moscow intended provocation or something more permanent. The concrete barriers began rising on a Sunday morning in August, construction crews working with military efficiency, while Western intelligence agencies scrambled to understand whether this wall represented defensive posturing or aggressive encirclement of Allied access rights. Kennedy's advisors gathered in shirt sleeves despite the air conditioning, their academic backgrounds suddenly inadequate for interpreting whether Khrushchev had outmaneuvered them or merely solved his refugee problem with reinforced concrete and barbed wire. The telephone rang with frantic calls from Bonn and Paris, Allied leaders demanding American response, while Kennedy's team debated options that ranged from military confrontation to diplomatic protest, their inexperience showing in the careful way they weighed consequences. Bundy drafted position papers referencing Vienna summit conversations, searching for clues in Khrushchev's previous statements, while the dismissed Eisenhower advisors watched television coverage and muttered about weakness, about missed opportunities for decisive action. The wall grew taller with each passing hour, its construction timeline suggesting planning that predated Kennedy's inauguration, implying that perhaps the Soviets had calculated that new leadership meant temporary vulnerability. Tank treads scarred the cobblestones at Checkpoint Charlie, where American and Soviet armor faced each other across painted lines that separated ideological universes. Commanders awaiting orders from capitals, where younger advisors consulted professors, while older generals remained conspicuously silent. Kennedy stood in the Oval Office, calculating how many minutes separated, posturing from shooting war. How many miscommunications could transform this concrete barrier into the trigger for nuclear exchange his fresh team had theorized about, but never directly confronted. The presence of Eisenhower's dismissed advisors haunted these deliberations like ghosts of certainty, their absent counsel leaving Kennedy wondering whether experience might have provided clarity his intellectuals could only approximate through analysis. Secretary McNamara's computerized threat assessments covered the conference table, numerical probabilities replacing the gut instincts that had guided previous administrations through Berlin crises, when massive retaliation remained America's only articulated response. The crisis diffused gradually through careful calibration, Kennedy's team navigating between Allied expectations and Soviet determination without triggering the escalation both sides theoretically desired to avoid. The wall remained standing as testimony to changed Cold War realities, its concrete slabs suggesting that perhaps Kennedy's dismissal of experienced advisors had left American policy reactive rather than anticipatory, responding to Soviet initiatives instead of shaping events. His young advisors claimed victory in crisis management, pointing to avoided war as vindication of flexible response doctrine, while dismissed officials noted privately that Eisenhower had kept Berlin whole and Kennedy had accepted its division. The president never publicly questioned whether retained experience might have prevented the wall entirely, whether institutional knowledge carried value beyond the outdated thinking he had purged so thoroughly from his administration's deliberations. The secure telephone lines burned with late-night conversations between dismissed officials who gathered in Georgetown townhouses, their whiskey glasses, sweating condensation rings onto classified documents they technically no longer possessed authorization to review. Alan Dulles sat in his study, surrounded by framed photographs from Guatemala and Iran, operations that had succeeded when presidents trusted CIA expertise rather than questioning every assumption with academic skepticism that mistook caution for wisdom. His former deputies passed manila folders across mahogany tables, sharing intelligence assessments that Kennedy's new team had rejected as outdated thinking, their marginalized voices finding audience only among themselves while the administration charted courses through uncharted waters. The dismissed advisors composed memoranda warning of inexperience translating into catastrophe, documents that circulated through Pentagon-backed channels where generals sympathetic to Eisenhower's doctrine read them with grim recognition. They watched Kennedy's intellectual advisors treat Cold War confrontation like seminar discussions, debating nuances while Soviet concrete divided Berlin and Castro consolidated power 90 miles from Florida's coastline. The National Security Council meetings had transformed into battlegrounds where Eisenhower loyalists, still embedded in secondary positions, challenged every assumption Kennedy's inner circle presented as innovation, requiring immediate implementation. Air Force generals questioned McNamara's systems analysis approach to nuclear deterrence, their combat ribbons contrasting sharply with his Ford Motor Company credentials as they argued that spreadsheets could not calculate human factors in warfare. Admiral Burke confronted Kennedy directly about Navy force reductions, his voice carrying the weight of Pacific campaigns, while the president's advisors countered with budget projections and strategic recalculations that dismissed traditional military thinking. The tension vibrated through mahogany-paneled rooms where portraits of previous presidents witnessed ideological combat disguised as policy debate, each meeting ending with compromises that satisfied neither faction completely. Kennedy felt the resistance like undertow against his administration's momentum, these institutional guardians protecting Eisenhower's legacy by questioning every departure from established Cold War orthodoxy with warnings wrapped in patriotic concern. The Washington Post began publishing anonymous quotes from displaced officials, warning that Kennedy's personnel purge had created dangerous knowledge gaps in America's Cold War apparatus at precisely the moment Soviet aggression demanded experienced leadership. Journalists received late-night telephone calls from former advisors who spoke carefully about national security risks without directly criticizing presidential authority, their coded language suggesting incompetence without committing actionable insubordination. Kennedy's team counterattacked through friendly columnists, framing resistance as obsolete thinking, clinging desperately to failed strategies that had produced the missile gap illusion and lost American prestige. The battle played across editorial pages while Berlin remained divided and Laos descended into chaos, each Cold War setback becoming ammunition for whichever faction could claim vindication through selective interpretation of unfolding events. The president felt Eisenhower's shadow, lengthening across every decision as dismissed advisors transformed into external critics whose warnings about inexperience gained credibility with each crisis that defied his new team's theoretical frameworks. He wondered privately whether institutional memory carried wisdom his intellectuals lacked, whether firing wholesale had been revolutionary necessity or prideful mistake that had weakened American Cold War. Response during history's most dangerous confrontation. The question haunted cabinet meetings, where younger faces proposed solutions while absent experience lingered like reproach, reminding Kennedy that leadership required balancing innovation against the hard-won knowledge that only survived crises could provide to those willing to listen. The reconnaissance photographs spread across Kennedy's desk revealed Soviet missile installations in Cuba with terrifying clarity, each shadow and construction detail forcing him to confront whether his hand-picked team possessed the wisdom necessary for nuclear brinkmanship at its most perilous moment. His younger advisors surrounded the Oval Office with competing recommendations, their Harvard degrees and theoretical frameworks suddenly inadequate against the reality of warheads 90 miles from American shores. Kennedy found himself wondering what Eisenhower's dismissed generals might counsel, whether their conventional thinking contained survival instincts his intellectuals lacked as they debated blockade versus airstrike with academic detachment that ignored the apocalyptic stakes. The president's hand trembled slightly as he studied satellite imagery, realizing his personnel revolution had placed humanity's fate in hands that had never faced combat decisions where miscalculation meant millions dead. McNamara's systems analysis offered probability calculations while the Joint Chiefs demanded immediate military action, leaving Kennedy navigating between extremes without the institutional ballast he had dismissed as obsolete thinking. The crisis stretched through 13 days that aged him visibly, each hourly meeting revealing how theory collapsed under pressure that required intuition born from experience his team collectively lacked. He made decisions alone in those October nights, second-guessing whether different advisors might have prevented this confrontation or managed it with wisdom earned through previous Cold War battles rather than seminar discussions. The aftermath of Cuban missiles brought Kennedy no satisfaction despite Khrushchev's eventual retreat and public claims of diplomatic victory that masked how narrowly catastrophe had been avoided. His reorganized intelligence apparatus had failed to detect the installations until construction was substantially advanced, validating warnings that purging experienced personnel created dangerous, blind spots in America's early warning systems. Vietnam demanded increasing attention from advisors who approached counterinsurgency with intellectual confidence that mistook theory for battlefield reality. Their recommendations for limited troop deployments carrying echoes of academic certainty rather than combat wisdom. Kennedy watched his team navigate escalating commitments in Southeast Asia with growing unease, recognizing how their innovative strategies produced unintended consequences that Eisenhower's dismissed advisors might have anticipated from hard experience. The nuclear test ban treaty negotiations revealed his new diplomats' strengths in patient dialogue, but also their naivete about Soviet negotiating tactics that older hands understood instinctively. Each success came weighted with complications. Each crisis resolution left questions about whether alternative counsel might have achieved better outcomes without the learning curve his personnel revolution had imposed. The president's private doubts intensified as he compared his team's performance against the institutional knowledge he had dismissed with such confidence during those early transition days. He confided to his brother Robert that perhaps wisdom required blending innovation with experience rather than completely replacing one generation's approach with another's untested theories. The Cold War granted no grace period for learning, no opportunity to correct mistakes without global consequences that made every personnel decision a gamble with civilization itself. Kennedy understood finally that leadership meant synthesizing rather than purging, incorporating rather than dismissing, building upon foundations rather than raising them. completely in revolutionary zeal that mistook change for improvement. The lessons emerged too slowly, purchased through crises that tested whether America could survive its own internal transformation while confronting external threats, demanding wisdom beyond any single generation's capacity. Kennedy's hand-picked advisors matured through trials that cost American lives and prestige, their education occurring in real time while the world watched. The dismissed officials observed from exile, their warnings partially vindicated by events, yet their solutions equally questionable, given how rapidly the Cold War landscape shifted. History would judge whether Kennedy's personnel revolution strengthened or weakened America's Cold War position, whether his new thinking saved or endangered the delicate balance preventing nuclear holocaust, whether leadership required destroying old structures or evolving them toward challenges neither generation fully comprehended until crisis forced terrible choices upon untested wisdom. The presidential libraries would become battlegrounds where historians fought proxy wars over Kennedy's purge, each declassified memo offering ammunition for competing interpretations that transformed personnel decisions into referendum on Cold War leadership itself. Scholars dissected transition documents with forensic intensity, searching for evidence that Eisenhower's dismissed advisors possessed wisdom Kennedy's team lacked, or conversely, that fresh thinking saved America from obsolete doctrines courting nuclear apocalypse. The debate consumed academic conferences throughout subsequent decades, each generation projecting contemporary anxieties onto Kennedy's choices as Vietnam's eventual catastrophe cast retroactive shadows across every Cold War decision made during those 1,000 days. Eisenhower's defenders argued institutional knowledge proved irreplaceable, that Kennedy's intellectual arrogance cost American lives in jungles where Harvard theories dissolved against guerrilla realities his predecessors understood. Instinctively, Kennedy's champions countered that flexibility prevented nuclear war, that missile crisis resolution demonstrated new thinking superiority over massive retaliation doctrines that offered only civilizational suicide as policy option. The argument remained unresolvable because history provided no control group, no alternative timeline, revealing what Eisenhower's advisors might have accomplished facing identical crises with different recommendations. Future presidents studied Kennedy's transition as cautionary tale and inspiration simultaneously, extracting contradictory lessons that justified whatever personnel approaches their own ideologies demanded. The Cold War's eventual conclusion without nuclear exchange seemed to vindicate Kennedy's gamble on generational change, suggesting that rigid thinking might indeed have produced the catastrophe his flexibility avoided. Yet Vietnam's expansion under advisors he handpicked cast permanent questions over whether different counsel might have prevented Southeast Asian quagmire that consumed 50,000 American lives and shattered national consensus. The missile gap controversy that justified his campaign attacks on Eisenhower proved largely fictional, intelligence failures occurring under both administrations with equal frequency, despite personnel overhauls promising improved assessments. Kennedy's structural reforms to National Security Council operations became template for successes, institutionalizing processes his team developed through crisis management that transformed ad hoc responses into systematic frameworks. The irony emerged slowly that his revolutionary changes themselves became establishment doctrine, his young intellectuals evolving into elder statesmen dispensing conventional wisdom to subsequent generations. The dismissed advisors faded into footnotes, their alternative approaches lost to history except as speculation about roads not traveled during humanity's most dangerous geopolitical confrontation. The Berlin Wall stood throughout Cold War decades as monument to crises Kennedy's team navigated, its concrete presence testifying simultaneously to successful deterrence and failed diplomacy, depending on interpretive framework applied. Soviet archives opened after communism's collapse revealed Khrushchev's genuine fear of Kennedy's unpredictability, suggesting inexperience itself functioned as strategic asset, preventing miscalculations based on predictable responses. American documents showed Kennedy's private agonizing over decisions made without institutional guidance he had rejected. His night conversations revealing doubts never expressed publicly, as confidence demanded projecting certainty, regardless of internal uncertainty. The personnel, revolution's full consequences, remained forever unknowable. Cause and effect, too entangled across too many crises for definitive judgment about whether wisdom required experience or innovation, continuity or disruption, inherited counsel or revolutionary thinking. History recorded only that humanity survived, that nuclear weapons remained unused, despite provocations and miscommunications that brought annihilation within decision cycles measured in minutes rather than deliberative hours. Whether Kennedy's hand-picked team deserved credit or merely luck, whether dismissed advisors might have managed crises better or worse, became questions that outlived participants and defied resolution. The transition established precedents about presidential prerogatives versus institutional continuity that echoed through subsequent administrations facing their own Cold War challenges, with personnel decisions carrying Kennedy's example as justification or warning. His legacy remained disputed across ideological divides, his choices interpreted through contemporary lenses that revealed more about present anxieties than historical realities of those nuclear-shadowed days. The ultimate verdict stayed suspended in permanent ambiguity, lost somewhere between what happened and what might have been, between the advisors who served and those dismissed, between the crises navigated and alternatives, forever speculation. Kennedy's revolution transformed American Cold War apparatus irrevocably, whether for better or worse, remaining the eternal question that no archive could answer, no memoir resolve, no historical distance clarify, beyond acknowledging that leadership during civilization's most perilous confrontation demanded judgments no preparation adequately equipped any generation to make with certainty that events would vindicate choices made under pressure, allowing no second chances. Was Kennedy's bold purge the decisive move that saved us from nuclear war, or did it nearly cost us everything? Subscribe to explore more untold Cold War stories that changed history forever.